Welcome back to Stamps Us, the channel where we explore fascinating coins, stamps, rare collectibles, history, and the stories behind the pieces that collectors love. Today, we are looking at a very interesting vintage United States postage stamp featuring one of the most influential figures in American legal history, Oliver Wendell Holmes. If you have this stamp in your collection, take a close look, because understanding its date, design, condition, variety, and market value can make a big difference when determining what it may be worth today. The stamp shown here is the United States 15-cent Oliver Wendell Holmes stamp, issued in 1968 as part of the famous Prominent Americans Definitive Series. It is catalogued as Scott number 1288 for the standard type I sheet stamp. The stamp was officially issued on March 8, 1968, in Washington, D.C., and it was printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing using a rotary press. Its beautiful magenta or reddish-purple color gives it a distinctive appearance, while the engraved portrait creates the detailed vintage look that many stamp collectors appreciate. The design shows a portrait of Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr.B., along with the large 15-cent denomination and the words U.S. Postage and Oliver Wendell Holmes. Holmes was born in Boston in 1841 and became one of the most important figures in American law. He served on the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts before President Theodore Roosevelt appointed him to the United States Supreme Court in 1902. Holmes remained on the Supreme Court for nearly 30 years and became famous for his powerful opinions, independent thinking, and support for freedom of speech. His legal writings and decisions had a lasting influence on American constitutional law, which is one reason the United States Postal Service chose to honor him on this stamp. The 1968 Holmes stamp was part of the Prominent Americans series, a long-running definitive series that honored important American historical figures. According to the National Postal Museum, the 15-cent magenta Holmes stamp was issued in sheet format with 11 by 10.5 perforations and was sold in panes of 100 stamps. The stamp shown in your image appears to be a normal perforated sheet stamp, but collectors should remember that several Oliver Wendell Holmes varieties exist. Later versions were produced in 1978 when the first-class postage rate reached 15 cents, and these included different die types, booklet stamps, and coil versions. This means that two Holmes stamps that look very similar at first glance can sometimes have different catalog numbers and different collector values. For that reason, collectors should carefully examine the perforations, design details, gum, tagging, cancellation, and overall format before deciding which variety they have. Now let's talk about condition, because condition is extremely important in stamp collecting. The stamp shown here appears to have its perforations intact and the design is clearly visible, but the exact market value cannot be determined from a photograph alone. Collectors normally examine the front and back of the stamp for gum condition, hinge marks, creases, tears, thinning, stains, fading, perforation damage, cancellation, and other imperfections. A mint never hinged stamp with excellent gum and clean perforations can be worth more than a used example, while a damaged or heavily cancelled example may be worth considerably less. Current dealer listings give us a useful idea of the ordinary market range. One current listing for Scott 1288 shows a single type I stamp around $0.3, while another listing from Mystic Stamp Company offers the 1968 15-cent Oliver Wendell Holmes stamp for about $0.9. Another stamp reference lists a mint, never hinged very fine example around $0.7. These differences demonstrate an important point. Stamp values are not fixed prices, and retail asking prices, catalog values, and actual selling prices can be very different. For an ordinary used or well-circulated example like the kind commonly found in collections, the market value may be only a small amount, often close to face value or below $1. A clean unused example in good condition may commonly fall somewhere around a few cents to roughly $1 depending on the exact variety and condition. Specialized varieties can be much more interesting, however. For example, the untagged pre-cancel variety Scott 1288A can command a substantially higher price than the ordinary stamp, and other varieties such as Type 2, booklet, coil, or imperforate versions may have different values. This is why you should never automatically assume that every 15-cent Oliver Wendell Holmes stamp has the same value. The stamp's exact identification is essential. Another important detail is that the stamp shown in the image should not automatically be considered a rare or extremely valuable stamp simply because it is old. This stamp is more than half a century old, but age alone does not make a postage stamp rare. Millions of ordinary definitive stamps were produced during the 20th century, and many remain in collections today. What makes a stamp more desirable is usually a combination of scarcity, condition, demand, printing variety, production error, special cancellation, provenance, or an unusual collectible feature. So if you see sensational online claims suggesting that a normal 1968 Oliver Wendell Holmes 15-cent stamp is worth thousands or millions of dollars, be very careful. The standard example shown here is generally a modest value collectible, not a million-dollar stamp. However, unusual varieties and special examples can be worth more, which is exactly why examining the details is so important. One of the most interesting aspects of this stamp is its connection to American history. Oliver Wendell Holmes was not simply a Supreme Court justice whose portrait appeared on a piece of postage. He was a major American legal thinker whose ideas continued to influence debates about constitutional rights, free speech, and the role of the courts. The stamp therefore represents both philatelic history and American history. When collectors preserve a stamp like this, they are preserving a small physical reminder of the people and events that helped shape the United States. If you own one of these stamps, I recommend keeping it in a proper archival stamp album, stock book, or protective mount rather than storing it loosely in an envelope or drawer. Avoid touching the gum with your fingers, avoid excessive moisture, and keep the stamp away from direct sunlight and extreme temperatures. If you believe your example could be an unusual variety, do not clean, trim, or alter it. Any attempt to improve an old stamp can actually reduce its collectible value. Instead, compare it carefully with reliable catalog references and, for potentially valuable varieties, consider getting an expert opinion. So, what is the bottom line for the 1968 U.S. 15-cent Oliver Wendell Holmes stamp shown in this video? The standard Scott 1288 Type I stamp is generally a common collectible with a modest market value. Current references and dealer listings suggest that an ordinary example can often be found for well under $1, with exact value depending heavily on whether it is mint or used, hinged or never hinged, and in what condition. Some specialized varieties can be worth several dollars or more, so identifying the exact version is the key. The most important thing to remember is that the face value of 15 cents is not the same as the collector value, and today's market value depends on the characteristics of the individual stamp. If you have this Oliver Wendell Holmes stamp at home, check the front and back carefully, examine the perforations, look for cancellation or tagging differences, and compare the design with the known varieties before making any valuation. And remember, the real value of collecting is not always measured in dollars. Sometimes a small stamp can carry an incredible story. And this 15-cent Oliver Wendell Holmes stamp connects us directly with one of the most influential American Supreme Court justices of the 20th century. Next up, we are taking a close look at a classic United States postage stamp featuring John Jay, one of the most important figures in early American history. The stamp shown here is the United States 15-cent John Jay stamp from the Liberty issue, issued in 1958. This is a particularly interesting stamp because John Jay was not only a founding father of the United States, but also the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The stamp features a detailed portrait of John Jay in a deep rose lake or reddish color, with the large 15-cent denomination at the lower left and the words U.S. Postage and John Jay clearly printed on the design. According to philatelic references, this stamp is identified as Scott number 1046, and it was issued on December 12, 1958, in Washington, D.C., as part of the famous Liberty issue, a large definitive series that honored important people, places, and symbols connected with American history. John Jay was born in New York in 1745 and became an important statesman, diplomat, lawyer, and political thinker during the formation of the United States. He served as president of the Continental Congress, helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolutionary War, and was one of the three principal authors of the Federalist Papers alongside Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. In 1789, President George Washington appointed John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. His role in the early American government makes him an especially appropriate person to appear on a United States postage stamp. The portrait used for the 15-cent Liberty issue stamp was based on a portrait of John Jay by the famous American artist Gilbert Stuart, giving the stamp an elegant and historically recognizable appearance. The Liberty issue itself was one of the major definitive stamp series of the 1950s and 1960 seconds, and the 15-cent John Jay stamp became an important part of that series. Now let's talk about the most important question for collectors. How much is this John Jay stamp worth today? The answer depends heavily on condition and the exact variety. The standard 1958 John Jay stamp, Scott 1046, is generally not considered a rare stamp, and ordinary examples can still be found at relatively affordable prices. Current dealer listings provide useful examples of the market. Kenmore Stamp currently lists a standard mint example around $1.1 and a used example around $0.25. While Arpin Philately lists a mint never hinged example at about 60 Canadian cents and a used example at about 25 Canadian cents. These are retail asking prices rather than guaranteed selling prices, so the actual amount a collector might receive can be lower or higher depending on demand, condition, and marketplace. The stamp shown in the photograph appears to be a single perforated example with the design clearly visible. But a photograph by itself is not enough to establish an exact professional grade or determine whether it has a special variety. When evaluating this stamp, collectors should carefully inspect the back as well as the front. Look at the gum, check whether the stamp has been hinged, examine the perforations for missing or damaged teeth, and look for creases, tears, thinning, stains, fading, or other defects. A clean mint, never hinged stamp can be more desirable than a heavily handled or damaged example. At the same time, a used stamp can still be an attractive and worthwhile collectible, especially when it has an interesting cancellation or postal history connection. There is another reason collectors should pay close attention to the John Jay stamp. The Liberty issue includes varieties, and the 15-cent John Jay exists as an untagged version, Scott 1046, and a tagged version, Scott 1046A. The tagged variety was issued later, on July 6, 1966. And it can be distinguished by the tagging used for automated postal processing. This means that if you have a John Jay stamp in an old collection, you should not simply look at the portrait and denomination and assume you know exactly which catalog variety you have. The date of issue, printing characteristics, tagging, perforations, and other details can all matter. Collectors who specialize in the Liberty issue often enjoy searching for these differences because they turn an ordinary-looking stamp into a much more interesting identification challenge. It is also important to understand that the word rare is often misused online. A stamp being old does not automatically mean that it is worth hundreds, thousands, or millions of dollars. The 1958 John Jay 15-cent stamp was produced for ordinary postal use, and the standard example is relatively common. So if you see an online video claiming that every 1958 John Jay stamp is worth thousands of dollars, that claim should be treated with caution. For a normal example in good condition, a realistic modern market discussion is generally in the range of cents to around $1 or a few dollars depending on condition and exact variety, rather than an enormous fortune. Current dealer listings support the idea that standard examples remain affordable collectibles. However, collectors should never ignore unusual varieties because specialized examples can have substantially different values. The best approach is to identify the stamp first and value it second. If your stamp appears to have unusual tagging, a printing difference, a major error, an exceptional cancellation, or an outstanding condition, it may deserve a closer examination by a knowledgeable philatelist or professional stamp dealer. The American Philatelic Society also recommends using established catalogs for identification and valuation, with the Scott U.S. Stamp Catalog being the standard reference commonly used by collectors in the United States. Another fascinating aspect of this stamp is its place in the Liberty issue. During the 1950s and 1960 seconds, the United States Postal Service used definitive stamps to keep important denominations available for everyday postage while also featuring major American historical subjects. John Jay was an excellent choice because his contributions reached across the Revolutionary period, early American diplomacy, the creation of the federal government, and the development of the Supreme Court. When you hold this small 15-cent stamp, you are holding a miniature piece of American history that connects postal collecting with the story of the nation's founding. For collectors who enjoy historical subjects, this is one of the reasons the stamp remains interesting even though the standard example is not particularly expensive. If you have one of these stamps in your collection, take a few moments to inspect it carefully. Check whether it is mint or used, examine the gum if it is unused, look at the perforations, inspect the back for hinges or damage, and compare it with reliable catalog images. Do not clean the stamp, do not attempt to remove gum or stains, and never trim the perforations to make the stamp look better. Any alteration can destroy collectible value. Store the stamp in an archival quality album or protective mount and keep it away from excessive moisture, heat, and direct sunlight. So, what is the final verdict on this 1958 United States 15-cent John J. stamp? It is a historically important and attractive vintage U.S. stamp, but the standard example is generally a modest value collectible rather than a rare fortune. A normal used example may be worth only a small amount, while a clean mint example can bring more, with current dealer listings giving examples around the $1 range for standard mint material. Specialized varieties, particularly the tagged version and other unusual examples, should be identified separately because their values can differ. Most importantly, don't judge this stamp only by its age. Judge it by its condition, variety, scarcity, and collector demand. The real attraction is the combination of beautiful design, American history, and philatelic significance. John Jay helped shape the young United States, and this little 15-cent stamp keeps his legacy alive in collections around the world. Next up, we are taking a close look at a beautiful purple 3-cent George Washington stamp from 1932. At first glance, it may look like just another old stamp from a collection, but this little piece of paper has an interesting story connected to one of the biggest changes in the U.S. postal system during the early 1930s. The stamp shown here features George Washington wearing his familiar military-style hat, surrounded by detailed engraved lines and the words United States Postage at the bottom. The denomination is clearly shown as 3 cents, while the dates 1732 and 1932 appear on either side of Washington. Those dates are an important clue because 1932 marked the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth. The U.S. Post Office issued an entire series of Washington Bicentennial stamps to celebrate the occasion, but there is an important detail that collectors need to understand. The stamp in the image appears to be the 3-cent Washington Bicentennial commemorative, rather than the later regular issue 3-cent Washington stamp that collectors identify as Scott number 720. The 1932 Washington Bicentennial series contained multiple denominations and different portraits of Washington. The series was designed to show Washington at different periods of his life and was first placed on sale on January 1, 1932. In Washington, D.C., the 3-cent denomination is particularly interesting because 1932 was a year of change for American postage. When the Washington Bicentennial series first appeared, the standard first-class letter rate was still 2 cents. Later that year, the basic first-class letter rate increased to 3 cents. This created a major demand for 3-cent stamps, and the post office needed additional stamps quickly. This change eventually led to another famous 1932 Washington stamp, Scott number 720. Instead of creating an entirely new design from scratch, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing adapted the popular 2-cent Washington Bicentennial design into a 3-cent regular issue. The dates and surrounding elements were removed, and the design was printed in deep violet. Scott number 720 was issued on June 16, 1932. Now let's take a closer look at the stamp shown in this video. The first thing that stands out is the deep violet or purple color. The portrait of Washington is highly detailed, with thousands of fine engraved lines creating the shading in his face, clothing, and famous hat. These engraved details are one of the reasons old U.S. stamps can be so fascinating to examine under magnification. The next thing collectors should examine is the perforation. Those tiny holes around the edges were designed to make individual stamps easier to separate from a sheet. The exact perforation pattern can help collectors distinguish between different issues and varieties. For example, the regular 1932 Scott number 720 has perforations listed as 11 by 10. Condition is another major factor when determining the value of an old stamp. Simply being nearly 100 years old does not automatically make a stamp rare or expensive. Collectors look at centering, perforations, gum condition, cancellations, tears, creases, stains, thinning, and other defects. A stamp that has survived in exceptionally clean condition can be considerably more desirable than an ordinary example that has been damaged or heavily canceled, and this is where many people make a mistake when searching online for stamp values. You may find websites or marketplace listings claiming that an ordinary old stamp is worth hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of dollars. But an asking price is not necessarily the same thing as the actual market value. Collector values depend heavily on the exact variety and condition. For the regular 1930 to 3-cent Washington Scott number 720, current reference information shows that ordinary examples are generally inexpensive. One stamp reference lists used examples around only a few cents and unused examples at modest prices, while dealer listings can vary depending on condition and format. So if you own one of these stamps, don't immediately assume that the stamp itself is worth thousands of dollars. Instead, look for the characteristics that could make your particular example more interesting. Extremely unusual perforations, plate varieties, booklet panes, coil versions, major printing errors, exceptional centering, or unusual multiples can attract much more attention from specialists. For example, the 1932 Washington issue was produced in several formats. In addition to the ordinary sheet stamp, there were booklet and coil versions. The booklet version is identified as Scott #720B, while the coil versions are Scott number 721 and number 722. These distinctions can be important because to stamps that look very similar at first glance may actually be different catalog varieties. Another fascinating part of this story is the enormous quantity of some 1932 Washington stamps that were produced. Scott number 720, for example, had an extremely large printing, with reference information listing more than 24 billion ordinary examples issued. That helps explain why an ordinary example is not considered a rare stamp simply because it is almost a century old. This is an important lesson for every new stamp collector. Age alone does not determine value. A stamp from 1932 can be worth only a small amount, while another stamp from the same era can be worth dramatically more because of rarity, condition, scarcity, an error, or a specialized variety. So what should you do if you find one in an old family album? First, don't clean it. Don't wash it, don't scrape it, and don't try to remove it from an envelope or album page aggressively. Old stamps can be extremely fragile, and attempts to improve their appearance can actually destroy collector value. Second, examine the stamp under good lighting. Look closely at the perforations and the corners. Check whether the stamp is centered properly. Look for unusual printing characteristics, missing perforations, double impressions, color problems, or other abnormalities. Third, determine whether it is mint or used. A mint stamp with original gum can have a different value from a used stamp with a cancellation. But again, the exact variety and condition matter. And finally, compare the stamp with a reliable specialized catalog or consult an experienced philatelist before assuming that an unusual-looking stamp is a major rarity. The stamp we're looking at today is also a wonderful reminder of how closely postage stamps are connected to American history. In 1932, the United States was celebrating 2 centuries since the birth of George Washington. The post office used stamps as miniature historical portraits, allowing millions of ordinary Americans to see images of Washington every time they mailed a letter. Think about that for a moment. A tiny piece of paper that originally represented only a few cents of postage could travel across the country, pass through the hands of postal workers and families, and eventually end up inside a collection nearly a century later. That's what makes stamp collecting so fascinating. The financial value is only one part of the story. The historical value, design, engraving, production methods, and journey of a stamp can make it fascinating even when its market price is modest. And if you happen to have a group of these 1932 Washington stamps, don't judge the entire collection by one ordinary example. Look carefully for varieties and unusual pieces. Sometimes the most interesting item isn't necessarily the stamp with the highest denomination. It could be a booklet pane, a coil stamp, a plate block, an unusual perforation, or a genuine printing error. One more important point: the exact stamp in your collection should always be identified before assigning a value. The 1932 Washington issues can look remarkably similar, and a small difference in perforations, format, design, or production can change the catalog identification. So, Is this little 3-cent Washington stamp a hidden fortune? For an ordinary example, probably not. Current reference sources indicate that common examples of the 1930 to 3-cent Washington issues generally have modest collector values rather than extraordinary prices, but that doesn't make the stamp unimportant. Quite the opposite. It represents an important moment in American postal history, a major celebration of George Washington, and a fascinating period when the U.S. postal rate was changing, and that's the real lesson for collectors. Don't just look at the price, look at the story. A stamp that cost only 3 cents nearly a century ago can still give us a window into the United States of 1932. It can tell us about Washington, American postal rates, engraving technology, printing, design, and the everyday communication of an earlier generation. So if you have old stamps sitting in a drawer, an inherited album, or a box that hasn't been opened for decades, take another look. You might not find $1 million rarity, but you could discover an important piece of American history. Next up, we're taking a close look at a classic 3-cent U.S. Washington stamp featuring George Washington in profile. This beautiful green stamp may look simple at first, but its design comes from an important period in American postal history. And stamps like this can be especially interesting to collectors because identifying the exact issue, printing, perforation, and condition can make a major difference. The first thing that immediately catches our attention is the portrait of George Washington. Washington appears in a left-facing profile inside a large oval frame. Around the portrait is an elaborate engraved design, with the word postage across the top and 3 cents across the bottom. The strong green color gives the stamp a distinctive appearance, while the fine engraved lines create detailed shading across Washington's face, hair, and clothing. This type of design is associated with the classic U.S. postage stamps featuring Washington. During this period, Washington's portrait appeared on stamps used by millions of Americans, making his image one of the most recognizable designs in American philately. However, several different U.S. 3-cent Washington stamps can look surprisingly similar. That means collectors should never identify a stamp only by its color and portrait. The stamp shown here has the appearance of an early 3-cent Washington issue, and the exact identification should be confirmed by examining details such as the perforations, paper, printing characteristics, gum, cancellation, and the back of the stamp. These details are extremely important because a small difference can separate one catalog number from another. Now let's talk about why the 3-cent denomination was so important. During the 19th century, postage rates were changing as the American postal system developed. The 3-cent rate became particularly important for ordinary letters, and the United States produced large quantities of 3-cent stamps featuring Washington. These stamps were not created simply as decorative collectibles. They were everyday postage used on letters traveling between families, businesses, government offices, and communities across the country. Imagine receiving a letter more than a century ago with a small green Washington stamp attached to the envelope. That tiny piece of paper could have traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles before eventually being saved by a collector. Today, a surviving example gives us a physical connection to the communication system of 19th century America. One of the most fascinating things about old U.S. stamps is the printing technology used to create them. Many classic American stamps were produced using engraved printing techniques. Instead of simply placing a flat image onto the paper, engraved lines were used to create the design. When you look closely at Washington's portrait, you can see how countless fine lines create different shades and textures. This is one reason a magnifying glass is such an important tool for stamp collectors. When examining a stamp like this, collectors don't simply look at the portrait. They study the tiny details. They inspect the lettering, the frame, the numerals, the perforations, the paper, and the overall impression of the design. Even the spacing between the perforations can provide valuable information. The perforations are especially important. Look around the edges of the stamp and you'll see the small holes that allowed individual stamps to be separated from a larger sheet. Different issues can have different perforation measurements. Some classic U.S. stamps were also issued without perforations, while others were perforated using different gauges. Therefore, counting or measuring the perforations can sometimes help identify an otherwise confusing stamp. Another important factor is the condition. A stamp from the 19th century has survived for a remarkably long time. More than a century of handling can leave its mark. Collectors look for tears, creases, thins, stains, fading, damaged perforations, heavy cancellations, and other problems. A stamp with excellent margins and clean, undamaged perforations can be much more desirable than an example that has been heavily damaged, but there's an important lesson here: old does not automatically mean valuable. A stamp can be more than a century old and still have a relatively modest market value if it is common and in ordinary condition. At the same time, another stamp from the same period can be worth substantially more if it is scarce, has a rare variety, possesses an unusual error, or survives in exceptional condition. That's why collectors should be careful when they see dramatic online claims about old stamps supposedly being worth thousands or even millions of dollars. An online listing showing a huge asking price does not necessarily mean someone actually paid that amount. The real value of a stamp depends on its exact identification, condition, rarity, certification when applicable, and what buyers are willing to pay in the actual market. So what should you do if you discover one of these old 3-cent Washington stamps in an inherited collection? The first thing is simple: don't clean it. Never try to wash an old stamp, polish it, straighten it with excessive pressure, or remove a cancellation yourself. Attempts to improve the appearance can permanently damage the paper and reduce its collector appeal. Instead, handle the stamp carefully and examine it under good lighting. Look at the front, look at the back, check the perforations, look for gum if the stamp is unused, and examine the cancellation if it is used. Most importantly, compare the stamp against a specialized U.S. stamp catalog or have it examined by an experienced philatelist. The back of the stamp can sometimes be just as important as the front. For unused stamps, collectors may examine the original gum and look for signs of disturbance. For used stamps, the cancellation itself can provide information about how and where the stamp was used. Condition also includes centering. Ideally, the printed design should be well centered inside the perforations. If the design is noticeably shifted toward one side, collectors may consider the stamp poorly centered. Exceptional centering can make a difference, especially for classic issues where high-quality examples are difficult to find. Another factor is whether the stamp has been repaired. Some very old stamps have been professionally repaired because collectors wanted to preserve damaged pieces. But a repaired stamp is not equivalent to an untouched example in the same condition. This is why experienced collectors inspect stamps carefully before making a purchase. Now let's return to the beautiful stamp shown in this video. The green color immediately makes it stand out. The large oval surrounding Washington creates a strong visual frame, while the decorative elements around the portrait give the stamp a formal 19th century appearance. The typography is also fascinating. The word postage arches across the top, while 3 cents is displayed prominently along the bottom. This combination of portrait, typography, and engraving gives the stamp the unmistakable appearance of classic American postage. And that's one of the reasons Washington stamps are so popular with collectors. George Washington is not just another historical figure on a stamp. He was the first president of the United States and one of the central figures in the founding of the nation. His portrait became a recurring symbol in American postal history, appearing on countless stamps over many decades. Because of that, Washington stamps offer collectors a fascinating way to follow the evolution of U.S. stamp design. You can start with early 19th century issues and move forward through different printing technologies, colors, denominations, perforation systems, and artistic styles. A simple Washington collection can therefore become an entire journey through American philately. And there is another reason this particular stamp deserves attention: its age. If this is indeed an early U.S. 3-cent Washington issue, you're looking at an artifact that has survived from a completely different era of American life. There were no modern computers, smartphones, or internet communications. A handwritten letter was an important way for people to stay connected, and postage stamps were an essential part of that system. Every stamp carried a letter forward. Every cancellation recorded a moment in its journey, and some of those stamps survived long after the letters themselves disappeared. That is what makes stamp collecting so special. You aren't simply collecting pieces of paper. You're collecting pieces of history. Now, could a stamp like this be worth a significant amount of money? The answer depends entirely on the exact identification and condition. An ordinary example may have a relatively affordable collector value, while a scarce variety, unusual production error, exceptionally well-preserved example, or rare cancellation can be considerably more desirable. So don't judge this stamp simply because it says 3 cents. The denomination tells us what the stamp was originally used for. It doesn't tell us its modern collector value. The same principle applies to almost every old stamp you may find. A 1-cent stamp isn't necessarily worth 1 cent. A 3-cent stamp isn't necessarily worth 3 cents. And a stamp that looks ordinary can sometimes turn out to be much more interesting after careful examination. This is why experienced collectors spend so much time studying tiny details. They look for differences that an average person might completely overlook: a slightly different perforation, a printing variety, a paper difference, an unusual cancellation, a plate variety, a missing design element, a genuine printing error, or simply an unusually beautiful example in outstanding condition. Initiating Happy Dance Protocol. Please stand. These details can transform the collecting story of a stamp. So if you have old US stamps sitting in a family album, a box, an envelope, or an attic collection, don't rush to sell everything as one large group. Take your time. Separate the stamps carefully, identify them individually, and research the varieties. And if you believe you have something particularly unusual or valuable, consider getting an expert opinion or professional certification before making a major buying or selling decision. One final piece of advice for anyone beginning a stamp collection: never judge a stamp only by its age. Instead, ask 5 questions. What exact issue is it? When was it produced? How common is it? What condition is it in? And does it have any variety or error that makes it different from the normal examples? Those questions will take you much further than simply searching for the highest price you can find online. The green 3-cent Washington stamp we're looking at today is a perfect example of why identification matters. Its classic portrait, engraved appearance, and historic design make it a fascinating piece of American postal history. But determining its precise collector value requires more information than the front image alone can provide, and that's the exciting part. There may be another clue waiting on the back. There may be a perforation measurement that changes the identification. There may be a cancellation that tells us something about its history. Or it may simply be a beautiful, historically important example of classic American postage. Either way, it deserves a closer look. So, if you have old US stamps sitting in a family album, a box, an envelope, or an attic collection, take them out and examine them carefully. You never know what story might be hiding behind a tiny piece of paper. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe to Stamps USA for more fascinating US stamps, rare varieties, historical issues, collecting tips, and stories about the stamps that could be hiding in ordinary collections. And remember, before you throw away an old stamp, look closely, because sometimes the smallest pieces of paper can carry more than postage. They can carry a piece of American history. Next up, take a close look at this small black 3-cent stamp. It carries the words Post Office and Official Stamp, and its design immediately tells us that this is something different from the ordinary US postage stamps people used on everyday personal letters. This is the fascinating 1873 United States 3-cent Post Office Department official stamp, commonly identified by collectors as Scotto 49. And today on Stamp Us, we are going to explore its history, its purpose, its collectible value, and the important details that could make one example worth more than another. At first glance, this stamp may look simple. It is black, it has a large number 3 in the center, and it has an elaborate 19th century engraved design surrounding the denomination. But behind this simple appearance is an important chapter in American postal history. This stamp was part of the special official stamp issues introduced in 1873 for the different departments of the United States government. These stamps were not simply created as decorative alternatives to regular postage. They were connected to a major change in the way government mail was handled. Before 1873, the United States government had what was known as the franking privilege, which allowed certain government officials and departments to send official correspondence without paying postage in the ordinary way. When that system was abolished, the government needed another method for identifying and accounting for official mail. Beginning July 1, 1873, special official stamps were supplied for government departments. The stamps were marked Official Stamp, and different departments received stamps in different colors. The Post Office Department used black official stamps, which is why the stamp we are looking at today has this distinctive black appearance. The 3-cent denomination was especially important because 3 cents was the standard domestic first-class letter rate for a half-ounce letter during this period. That means the denomination was not random. It represented an actual postage rate of the time. When government correspondence required that rate, the appropriate official stamp could be used to account for the postage. Now let us take a closer look at the stamp itself. The large numeral 3 dominates the center, making the denomination immediately recognizable. Around it is the strong oval design containing the words Post Office and Official Stamp. The surrounding ornamental details reflect the engraving style of 19th century American stamps. This is one reason classic U.S. stamps are so interesting to collectors. Even a tiny piece of paper can contain an enormous amount of historical information. This particular design is cataloged as Scott 049, the 1873 3-cent Post Office Department official stamp. Collectors generally identify it by its black color, its Post Office Department Association, its 3-cent denomination, and its distinctive official stamp design. Modern catalog and dealer references continue to list 049 as a collectible United States official stamp, but now we come to the question that almost every collector wants answered. How much is this stamp worth today? The first thing you need to understand is that there is no single price for every 1873 3-cent 049 stamp. The market value depends heavily on condition, centering, gum, perforations, cancellation, paper characteristics, and whether the stamp has an unusual variety or special feature. Two stamps that look almost identical to a casual observer can have very different values to an experienced collector. As a general market reference, a 2025 dealer catalog lists the ordinary 049 at about $1.80 in one used condition column, about 95 cents in another condition category, and about 75 cents in another, while unused examples are listed at approximately $9.95, $5.50, and $2.95 depending on condition. These figures demonstrate something important. The ordinary example is collectible, but it is not automatically a high-dollar rarity. Current marketplace listings show a similar picture. Recent examples of used 049 stamps have been offered around $4, $9, and even around $12 when sellers describe them as superb or especially attractive examples. Another used example with damaged perforations sold for under $2. These differences show why condition and presentation matter so much in the stamp market. So if you have one of these stamps sitting in an old album, envelope, box, or family collection, should you immediately expect to find a fortune? Probably not. An ordinary used example may be worth only a few dollars or less, but that does not mean you should ignore it. The real excitement begins when you discover something unusual. One of the most important things to check is the condition of the perforations. Look carefully around all four sides. Are the perforations complete? Are any pulled, short, or damaged? Does the stamp have unusually large margins? Is the stamp well centered? These details can make a significant difference in how collectors view an individual example. Next, examine the cancellation. Some cancellations are ordinary and have little effect on value. Others may be unusually clear, attractive, scarce, or historically interesting. A fancy cancellation can sometimes make an otherwise ordinary stamp much more desirable to specialists. Recent marketplace examples of 049 with distinctive target or fancy cancellations have been offered around the $9 range, showing how the cancellation can become part of the collectible appeal. You should also inspect the back of the stamp. If the stamp is unused, collectors will want to know about the original gum. Has it been hinged? Is the gum disturbed? Is there no gum? Is it original? Is the stamp never hinged? These distinctions can dramatically affect value, particularly for classic 19th century stamps. Another important factor is centering. A stamp with excellent centering and clean perforations can be much more attractive than a poorly centered example. Collectors often pay premiums for stamps that combine strong color, clean design, excellent centering, and sound perforations. The paper should also be examined by an experienced collector. Historical U.S. stamps can exist on different paper characteristics, and specialists sometimes study paper texture, ribbing, printing characteristics, and other production details. Some unusual paper varieties can be significantly more interesting than a normal example. There is another reason you should never judge an old stamp entirely from a photograph. The image can tell us a lot, but it cannot reliably reveal everything that matters to a professional valuation. A photograph cannot always confirm the exact paper type, gum condition, hidden repairs, thinning, perforation quality, or authenticity. If you believe your stamp could be an important variety, professional examination or certification may be worthwhile. And this brings us to one of the biggest mistakes new collectors make. They see a very old stamp and immediately assume that age alone makes it extremely valuable. That is not how the stamp market works. Age is important, but rarity, condition, demand, and documented market results are usually much more important when determining actual value. For example, there are ordinary 049 examples available today for only a few dollars, but special examples can command much more. A remarkable example is the special printing of the 3-cent post office stamp. One recorded specimen error, a misspelling of specimen, was described as a major rarity and sold for $35,000 in a Robert Siegel auction. Another special printing 049 example with a specimen overprint sold for $2,600. These are not normal 049 stamps. They are extraordinary specialized examples, and that distinction is extremely important. There are also valuable plate blocks associated with this issue. A large plate block can be worth dramatically more than a normal single stamp because it preserves information about the original printing plate and production process. One marketplace listing for a large 049 plate block has been offered for hundreds of dollars, illustrating how quickly the value can rise when you move from an ordinary single stamp to a specialized collectible. So when you look at your own stamp, do not simply ask, "Is this old?" Ask better questions. Is it the correct Scott number? Is it genuine? Is it unused or used? What is the condition? What type of cancellation does it have? Is the centering unusually good? Are the perforations complete? Does it have original gum? Does it show an unusual paper characteristic? Is it part of a plate block or larger multiple? Could there be a printing or overprint variety? Those are the questions that can turn a simple stamp hunt into serious philatelic research. The history behind these official stamps is also fascinating. According to the American Philatelic Society, the government supplied official stamps specifically for public business, and strict records were kept concerning the stamps received and used. The different departments received different colors, and stamps belonging to one department could not simply be substituted for another department's official mail. The Post Office Department received black stamps, while other departments received different colors. This makes the stamp in our video more than just an old piece of paper. It is a surviving artifact from a period when the United States was changing the way government mail was organized and accounted for. Every genuine example connects us to the postal system of the 1870s. Now let us talk about the stamp shown in this video specifically. From the photograph, the design strongly matches the 1873 3-cent Post Office Department official type, Scott 049. However, a photograph alone cannot establish a precise market grade or certify authenticity.